Thanks so much. I'm so thankful that this is not finding truth and goodness in your fantasy football league, because I don't know if I could give that talk with any integrity. I feel very honored to have this conversation with you. We are living in a time where there's so much brokenness. We all naturally desire truth and beauty and goodness. And I think that if you're like me, your heart is broken. Because each one of those things is harder to find than they used to be. It's harder to find what the truth is. It's harder to find that which is beautiful and to have it displayed for us by our politicians and by our other leaders and even in our community, because we're so torn from one another. And the goodness that we desire to see in terms of justice, in terms of things being right in our world, we're so divided on that as well. And so it really is an honor for me to spend some time with you, because I know that so many of us are feeling this brokenness. And where do we go from here? You know, that's part of what I hope to get us started talking about today. So let me share my screen with you. There we go. So what we're talking about again is finding truth and goodness in a manipulative world. And I want to point out from the beginning, not all manipulation is purposeful, right? Sometimes structures are set up in such a way that they manipulate us. So for instance, the way that our economy and the way the media and social media and the internet are set up, we get manipulated on a regular basis. This is because social media companies and news outlets are there to make a profit. And so the more sensationalistic the news report is, the more it feeds into our existing prejudices, the more money they'll make. And we all know that algorithms in Google and algorithms on our phones and algorithms on social media feed back to us what we've already selected and what they already know that we like. And so what are they doing? They're creating a world in our image for us. But that's a very narrow and diminutive and misguided world for each one of us, no matter how wise and circumspect we are. And so some of the manipulation, I think, is absolutely deliberate. And I think politicians on all sides of the spectrum, political spectrum, will manipulate us and want to manipulate us. And some of it is just people want money more than they want truth and goodness and beauty. So how do we negotiate that? How do we work this out? By the way, I wanted to call this event Avoiding Dupery, but Michelle said that was not professional enough. And I just love that phrase. If you know William James, his work, The Will to Believe, he uses the term dupery, which I think is a wonderful term. So I did sneak it in. Sorry, Michelle. What I want to do is talk about the way our brains are set up and how it makes us vulnerable to not finding the truth. It also makes us vulnerable to manipulation. So I want to talk about those vulnerabilities, and then I want to go through each one and show the kinds of logical fallacies that this leads us into, and the ways that it impacts us as we interact with one another about issues of politics and ethics and social issues. So the first issue that we have is that we always use simplifying heuristics. Simplifying heuristics are very quick decision-making processes that are not very well thought out, but we have to use them on a daily basis because we don't have a lot of time and we have so many responsibilities. So we stereotype, we make quick decisions, and then we go with it, right? And this works well for people who are busy, and most of the time for pragmatic issues, we do okay. But simplifying heuristics are not great ways to arrive at complicated truths. And so this is something that's built into us, but it's something that is also going to lead us into problems. It actually becomes a vulnerability for us. The second is teleological thinking. And the Greek word telos means the ultimate goal or end or meaning or purpose of a thing. So you and I are purposive beings. We tend to think in terms of meaning and purpose, whether it's there or not. So if there's something we're discussing and there's evidence missing, we'll fill in the gap in order to try to make a story out of it, right? So we're narrative beings You know that from time immemorial, human beings have been telling stories to one another. We're narrative beings. We're looking for the meaning. We're looking for the story in everything. Well, this is a beautiful thing about us, but it also means that rather than looking at what the evidence actually shows us, we are going to tend to want to tell a story that's simplified. And this is going to be a problem for us in terms of us finding real truth about complicated matters. And finally, this obviously is a catch-all category, our humanity, right? You and I are emotional beings. We're deeply interconnected. And I like to think of myself as an objective evidence evaluator. I like the original Star Trek, so I like to think of myself as Spock, just looking at everything in a logical fashion. But the fact is, I'm a menagerie of needs and desires and emotions and fears and experiences and choices I've made in the past that were good and bad that caused me not to want to change my way of thinking, right? So I'm deeply invested in those narratives that we just talked about. And because I need them, I need the stability. And because I feel vulnerable, it is very hard to dislodge my ways of thinking. So these are three main kinds of vulnerability that we have. We use simplifying heuristics, we use teleological thinking, and then the catch-all category of our humanity, our fears and our desires, and how the place that I'm standing in right now has been created by a lot of non-rational factors. So what I want to do is talk briefly, and I've got a little more than we could cover in this time, but I want to talk briefly about what are the ramifications of these three kinds of vulnerability for us. So first, simplifying heuristics. One simplifying heuristic is the availability heuristic. And this means, for instance, that we'll be more influenced by a few stories that we've heard than by objective social scientific evidence. And so if I hear a story, I relate to it and I can be influenced by it. This is why politicians are always telling stories, right? First of all, it's going to touch into something that we'll talk about in a minute. They want us to like them. That's pretty important. But if you can tell one story and give someone the impression that your viewpoint is correct without any argumentation whatsoever, right? So, for instance, I might say, I was in Iowa and I met this woman and she didn't have the proper health care. She couldn't afford her health care. And from that, I'm given the impression, man, there's something wrong with our healthcare system. Or, the other party's healthcare plan is better. But that is a hasty generalization fallacy. It's a sample size of one and it's unrepresentative. On any healthcare system, there are going to be people who are helped less and helped more. And yet, if we hear one story, we think, oh, this healthcare system is terrible. Well, that's a horrible reasoning. We all know that if we're going to make a general statement, we need to draw from a number of different representative cases, and there has to be a large number of them so that the sample size is good. So this availability heuristic, this tendency we have to be deeply impacted by stories, leads naturally to the hasty generalization fallacy. So you and I need to watch out for stories, right? Stories should help us empathize. And then we need to take the next step, which is, wow, let me research this. How common is this woman's from Iowa's story? Right? Is that an issue with the current healthcare system that's happening to a lot of people? So when we hear stories, we should not go directly to generalizations. We should go from story to investigation. But most of us don't do that. And again, we don't have time. So, that's why we look for these simplifying heuristics. Oh, story, this is what I believe. And then we have a bias in favor of authority and a bias, an emotional bias. Our authority bias comes again from how busy we are and stressed out and how much we hunger for meaning. We naturally want to find somebody we can trust who knows the truth and is good and will lead us to the promised land. We're looking for a Messiah. And for those of us who are people of faith, we know that that's something we should not do, that's a kind of idolatry, right? But we naturally, because we're busy and we feel insecure and we want the world to make sense, we have this natural psychological tendency to want to just believe in someone. We believe in our political candidate or we believe in our political party. And what happens when we do that is we give up our independence of thought. And so we have to be very careful about that. Emotional bias is when I like somebody, I tend to believe what they say. They've often said this about presidential candidates, that the one who wins is often the one who you'd like to have a beer with, right? Or a soda with, I guess. That's completely irrelevant in terms of whether their policies are good, but we're influenced that way. So this, again, we got to watch out for. And then finally, under this category, we've got the availability cascade, which means that the more we hear something, the more an idea is available to us, the more plausible it seems, whether or not we have any evidence for it. And so politicians have learned they can repeat falsehoods over and over and over again. You and I are stressed out, we're busy, and if it's a falsehood that we want to believe, then we're going to be strongly pulled to believing it. And we don't have the time to investigate them. So the way our brain works is the more we hear something, the more plausibility it has. And politicians manipulate us because of this tendency in our brains. And so this is part of the echo chambering problem that we all have, right? Again, the algorithms in our society, in media, social media, on the internet, I mean, even in the analog world of personal relationships, we tend to surround ourselves with people who think like we do. We read the stories that reinforce what we believe and feel. And Twitter and Google and Apple and Facebook, they just channel all those stories to us to make us feel good. Then they get more clicks and they make more money. So the echo chambering is happening to us, and there's a strong financial incentive. And in many cases, again, this is not deliberate, but it is real, and it's impacting us. It makes it hard for us to find what is really true. All right, so our next category of human vulnerability is our teleological thinking, our narrative thinking. So we tend to we want stories, and we've got stories that are universal about the meaning of life. We've got stories about the world. We have narratives about other countries. We have narratives about our own country and our role in it. Every narrative has us in the story. And so it's important for us to have a narrative that puts us in a good place in the story, or that at least puts us in a place where we feel that we can authentically live out that life. And so this narrative thinking is happening all the time in our brains. So what do politicians do then? They'll give us simplified narratives. And not just politicians, but people who are involved in social movements and our friends and our family, people on the radio. They'll give a simplified narrative. And they know, or they might not know, but we grasp at simplified narratives because we're stressed out. Here's a story that makes sense of it. Here's a story that makes sense of it. I'm gonna grasp onto that. So we have a strong inclination to grasp onto a simplified narrative. This is really problematic, right? It leads to two really serious logical fallacies. First is the false cause oversimplified fallacy. Someone will say, when Obama came into office, this happened, and we just assume that something about Obama's policies caused this to happen. Or when Trump came into office, this happened, and we just assume that Trump's policy or Trump as a man caused this to happen. We need actual argumentation to show causality. Instead, people will just tell a simple narrative. If it fits what I already want to believe, I'm just going to accept it. So that's the false cause oversimplified fallacy. And it's also the fallacy of suppressed evidence. This is probably the fallacy that people use the most in arguing about politics, ethics, and social issues. They're telling only one small sliver of the story, and they're suppressing or leaving out the rest of the story. And here's the fact about almost all issues we face. They are complicated. And you and I are not experts. As much as we would like to think we are, we aren't. And the simplified narrative makes me feel like I'm an expert, makes me feel, oh, I understand this, right? I took an economics course in college, and I learned a lot about economics, but one of the most valuable things I learned from that course is how much I don't know about economics, right? But if I hear someone on a radio show say, oh, if we do such and such, if we raise taxes or lower taxes, this is going to happen. And I just repeat that as if there aren't other economists who disagree with it. The fact is, the issues that we're facing are complicated. We don't like that. We don't like saying, you know what, this is what I think, but there's so much more that I don't understand. right? We don't like that. So oversimplified false cause fallacies we're susceptible to, suppressed evidence we're susceptible to. Now, what is one of the most common themes in our stories as human beings? The fight of good versus evil. We're deeply drawn to it. The first movie I ever saw by myself was Star Wars. And one of the reasons that that's the original Star Wars, episode 4 for you youngsters, the reason that story was so powerful, it was a classic good versus evil story, right? That is one of the most powerful and motivating kind of themes for us as humans. And so if our politicians or our activists or our teachers or our friends, our spouses, they tell a story that the other person is evil, the other side is evil and they want to destroy America, and this side is good, we naturally fall into that because that's a story that we've been telling as human beings for generations, right? So we are very influenced by that theme of good versus evil. What this leads to is what I think is one of the most harmful things and one of the biggest problems in our society today, and that is otherizing. What we do when we otherize is we say that person is a part of a group that is so wrong and misguided, and usually we impugn their motives, so they're evil, that I do not need to listen to them. I can reject them out of hand. I don't need to talk with them. If I do talk with them, I'm going to talk with them angrily because they're evil, right? So if I'm a Republican, I might do this to Democrats. If I'm a Democrat, I might do it to Republicans. If I'm a conservative Republican, I might do it to Trump Republicans or populist Republicans. And if I'm a moderate Democrat, I might do it to the liberal Democrats and vice versa. And so otherizing means I don't have to really listen to other people and empathize with their perspective. It's one of the most harmful things that we run into, but we're tricked into it so easily because we think in terms of good and evil. It goes way back. It's kind of built into our brains. And then finally, implications of our basic humanity, right? First of all, we naturally desire meaning and stability. So we living our lives, we get up every morning. Think about how busy you've been. I'm so thankful that people are here during the lunch hour. You know, who has time during the lunch hour to learn something or to have a conversation? And so I'm thankful that you're here because we want stability in our lives. We want there to be meaning to this day in, day out repetition of the things that we do. And what does this mean? Well, what I found actually is if you have someone who's deeply entrenched in a certain way of looking at things ethically, religiously, politically, you give them evidence against their viewpoint, you would think that that would lessen their confidence in their viewpoint. It has the opposite effect. The backfire effect is that people become more deeply entrenched in their viewpoint. So you give evidence to somebody, the impact is usually going to be that they become more deeply entrenched. They reject it out of hand. They say that's fake news, or they say that that's false, or they say they find some way to reject it, and they even hold more strongly to their beliefs than before, because we feel threatened, right, when somebody gives evidence that impugns our narrative or threatens our narrative. The other thing about us in terms of politics and ethics and religion is a lot of times we're influenced by our emotions first, and then we bring reason in along to buttress our emotions, what our emotions have told us. And this is why appeals to fear are so effective in politics. Our politicians will try to scare us, and sometimes it's not an appeal to fear fallacy if there's good evidence for it. But a lot of times they will try to scare us even where there's not strong evidence, because then they can control us. And you and I have to be in control of our emotions so that we're not manipulated by people who want to appeal to our fears or to our vanity, right? All of us, if you think back to when you were 12 or 13, how important it was to be in the in group, to be one of the cool kids, or at least to be in some kind of in group, right? So we want to belong. And what our politicians and others will say to us is, if you believe this, you belong. You're woke. You're one of the people who understands. You're woke, or you're a patriot, right? Everyone else is not a patriot. So we want to be in the woke group, or we want to be a patriot. And so they appeal to our vanity. You're one of the superior people because you agree with us on everything, right? And so it causes us to want to just go along with the majority view without questioning particular parts of what we believe. And then finally, this is ironic, I suppose, that the Bible tells us not to take the speck out of someone else's eye if you've got a log in your own eye. And what psychological research shows us is that we can see other people's biases far easier than we can see our own. So it's not really I guess it is my fault, but it's not totally my fault. It's understandable because I got a log in my eye. I can't see that log. That's the way my brain works, but I can see other people's biases very easily. And so I tend to think of myself as objective and fairly unbiased, but the others, again, are people who don't have the kind of integrity that I have. They have all these biases, and they're not good people. I am a good person. I don't have biases. The fact is that we're just blind to our biases, and study after study has shown that this is the case. And again, this leads to us otherizing, and it leads to us getting involved in echo chambering. Okay, so this is what we're facing, right? This is the challenge that we're facing. Just looking at 3 different kinds of vulnerabilities we have as human beings, and I hope you can see that politicians and the media and friends and family, whether they realize, some people do this deliberately, but whether they realize it or not, they're able to manipulate us unless we decide, hey, I want to be aware of these problems, and I want to make sure that they have as little impact on me as possible. And so what I want to do for the remainder of this talk before we open up for questions is just give some suggestions on how things we can do in order to make ourselves less vulnerable to these sorts of impacts, so that we really can find truth and goodness in a way that is consistent and real. So finding truth and goodness in a manipulative world, how do we do that? The most important thing we can start with is this: it starts with us, not with them. Remember, thinking that the main problem is them, that can be the result of our narrative, that can be a result of how we've been manipulated emotionally, it can be the result of us being led to otherize. So, and we can't do anything about them anyway directly. So let's start with us, and let's transform ourselves and the way that we look at the world. So what kinds of interchange can we be a part of? First of all, we want to make a habit of looking inward. Let's be honest about our insecurities, right? Every one of us is insecure about things. Let's find those out. Let's journal. Let's reflect on them. What are my needs? What are my fears and my desires? What are my hopes? If I'm not aware of them, other people can manipulate me based on them much more easily. And then how do I deal with these insecurities, right? If I'm honest with myself, do I realize that I cling to my political narrative, that I isolate myself from people who think differently, that I refuse to talk to my sister or my brother or my parents about politics or religion or ethics, right? So face my insecurities, identify my needs and fears and desires and hopes, make a habit of doing that, and look at how I deal with it, and then try to deal differently. And so that's, I think, very important. Serve other people, especially those very different from yourself. You might think all this is intellectual, how do we find truth? But the fact is, the goodness in us enables us to see things more clearly. And when you serve other people, it makes it much harder to otherize them. And so if there's a group of people you tend to disagree with, find a way to serve them. And then you'll find yourself empathizing with them in a way that you never did before. It's important for us to be healthy. How many of us in this virtual room got to a place over the last year or year and a half where we were just obsessed with politics or with social issues to such a degree that we were miserable? That we cannot make a difference if we're not healthy. So we have to regularly get out of our head, and we have to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves and recognize this: it does not all depend upon you. It's okay if many people in the world disagree with you, if many people in the country disagree with you. Sometimes we actually want to be a god, right? We want to remake the world in our image. And if everybody doesn't agree with us, it really frustrates us. but it's great not to be a God because there's only one of those. And so what we want to do is relax and recognize, hey, this doesn't all depend on me. I'm going to do my part, and I'm going to get out of my head. I'm going to think about these things as much as I can, but there are other things that I'm called to do and be, and I want to make sure that I keep it all in perspective. And then finally, we don't have a chance to talk about all these character traits, and I did touch on them in a previous talk. We need to develop character. And these are character traits that are absolutely essential to finding truth and goodness and developing productive relationships with other people with whom we disagree and building community. The way you develop character is by understanding that you need the character trait, and then you just practice it over and over again until it becomes part of you. And I'll just point out two of these here: courage and intellectual humility. Obviously, what I shared on the previous screen should show us that we're so emotionally tied into our narratives and our beliefs that allowing them to really be challenged and critiqued can be incredibly stressful for us. And so we need to develop the courage to talk with people and to allow them to question what we believe and to do it with an open heart and mind. And that's going to take courage. And for me as a Christian, what this does is drive me back to my faith, which is where do I get my security and stability from? The fact that I am a human being made in the image of God, and that God is my heavenly Father who is committed to me for eternity. So I can have courage if some of my worldview gets turned upside down, some of my beliefs. I want to focus on what Scripture says when Jesus says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me, and I in you, and you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." So I've got those resources, and we come from a lot of different faith perspectives and perspectives on faith. But for each one of us, we want to drive into that center spiritual issue of what makes us strong, what makes us valuable, what makes us people that are stable and are okay, right? And if we can do that with spiritual work, then we can exhibit the courage needed to really engage with other people on political and social and ethical issues. And then intellectual humility, we've talked about before in other talks. This is so important. Every virtue is a mean between an excess and a deficiency. And intellectual humility is that perfect place between being intellectually insecure, where you don't even realize what you know and you're afraid to talk about it, and intellectually arrogant, where you're so closed-minded, you think you can't be wrong and that everybody else is either has bad motives or is just dumb, right? If you have intellectual humility, you have strong beliefs that you hold to and that you're willing to discuss and defend, but you're also willing to open them up to critique. And you just love people. You are curious about what they what they think and how they see the world. So I just wanted to point out courage and intellectual humility here, and we could talk about some of these others as well if you'd like. Let me just briefly mention some other practical steps. When we're in a place of strength, we should engage with people who are different from us. And this means really listening to them and asking questions, not to try to trip them up or win the argument, but just clarifying questions, and then mirror back to them their thoughts and their emotions. Do I get this right? This is how you feel about this issue. This is why you're upset about this issue. This is what you believe is wrong with our community or our country or our family, right? So you mirror back those thoughts and emotions. Use thought experiments. Put yourself in their shoes, change roles with them, and imagine the world from their perspective. I would encourage you, let's say that you are a Democrat, right? I would encourage you to argue with Democrats from a Republican perspective. Just do that every once in a while. If you feel strong, you're against the death penalty, argue with people who are against the death penalty from the perspective of those who are for the death penalty. It's incredible how you'll start to have a more realistic viewpoint of the other side and have more empathy, and it increases your ability to interact with others. Finally, I say find an exploration buddy. There's got to be a better word for this, but Do you have friends who are very different from you, or family that's very different from you on some issue? Say, hey, let's take this next year, once a month at least. Let's talk about these issues. Find somebody of a good character, with a good mind, open mind, and just explore together your differences. So engage with people who are different. Master the fallacies. So I've shared some of the fallacies quickly with you today. Everybody should study the fallacies. I teach a course on critical thinking in which we master the fallacies. I encourage you to come audit that course, or take the course, or study on your own. And there's good resources available on the internet about the fallacies. And learn how not to use them, and learn how to recognize them when people are using them against you. Seek out alternate news sources. If you saw my bank of news on XM in my car, you would think, where's this guy coming from? Because it goes from super conservative to super liberal. And anytime that you hear an argument, we should naturally think, what does the other side say about this? Rather than just accepting it. So seek out alternate news sources and try to say, okay, well, someone says this, let me do some Google searching and try to find somebody who thinks the opposite and why. And if you ever can, get down to original research as opposed to just people's opinions. Study information literacy. This is something that we are really focusing on now in the core curriculum at Roberts. Learn to tell good sources from bad. Whenever you can, access original research. And then finally, show integrity on social media. I encourage you to critique people who post things, even if they are for your own side, if it's something you agree with. And I've done this from time to time, where I'll say, hey, I actually agree with this policy, but this is not a good argument, right? And here's why. If you want to give a better argument, maybe here's another way to do that. So just because someone posts something that you really like, you agree with, think about whether it's a good argument or not. And here's a tip. If it's a meme, it's not a good argument. Memes always are straw man fallacies or suppressed evidence fallacies. So if it's a meme, it's not good. And so I would encourage you to try not to use them in social media. And then if we all did this, it would be a much better world. Never post or forward anything on social media that you have not carefully researched yourself. Even you'll see this. Let's say it's really something strong against this candidate that you don't like. You just want to forward that. Care more about your integrity than you care about like feeling good that your side has got this gotcha meme, right? So never post or forward something that you haven't carefully researched. And then finally, I just want to end with this, and then we'll have some time for a few questions. You and I have to be committed to truth and love above all else. This means that we need to take our claws off of our narratives, and we have to say, look, I love the truth. And if someone shows me that I'm mistaken, I want to train myself to celebrate that. Or if they ask me a question I don't know the answer to, I want to celebrate that. I want to say, hey, wow, I have a chance to learn something new. So if we have this as our focus, if this would be the theme of the talk, pursue truth and love above all else. Try not to think that we're as important as we think we are, and just fall in love with truth and with love. That would be the summary, I would say, of the talk. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'll end there, and we should have some time for some questions, I believe. So I'm not sure if Kirk or Michelle is doing this.
So if you want to unmute yourself to ask a question, you're welcome to do that, or you can put the question in the chat and I will read it for you. So either one, but feel free to unmute and ask a question.
One of the things that I've been thinking about is, this is Rob Terrell from Buffalo, is I'm in the science area, but I've been thinking about, how people grab a hold of science truth. And I'm just wondering if you feel that there's a vulnerability that we as evangelicals have that's more prominent, that allows us to, for instance, grab a hold of authority more, to divide the world into a right and wrong. Do we have particular vulnerabilities from what you've seen from your experience?
I think that's a great question. And I think every group has their own unique vulnerabilities. And I think that you hit the nail on the head there, that I do think that evangelical Christians need to be especially careful about falling in love with authority figures, because we have been taught to find truth through authority, through the authority of Scripture, and Scripture is a guide to our life, and so that's a good thing, right? And these tendencies that I was talking about, they're not usually good or bad. They're just tendencies. So yes, we believe in authority, but we also, evangelicals in particular, also believe that God has given us critical faculties, and that we don't just believe what the pastor says, or we shouldn't just believe what the church says. We should reflect on it. We should try to believe it, live with it, talk with people humbly, and that God has given us a conscience and a mind that we need to actively use. And so I think that when evangelicals are more vulnerable to authority figures, it's because they haven't embraced all of the gifts that God has given them and the full calling that comes from God, which is to use these gifts to live with integrity. So I do think probably even anybody who believes strongly that there are not only matters of authority for us to believe, but matters of authority that sometimes go against our culture, right? Then that could lead us to disregard other people's viewpoints too much, or our culture too much, and trust too much in authority. So I think
I appreciate very much your emphasis on community. I think that's an important emphasis. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you so much.
Dr. Koehl, thank you for your presentation. I was reading a book, Why We Make Mistakes, and I think that particularly in that very beginning, it does talk about the idea of service in different language, and how important that is. But I would love to focus in on that from a pure racial paradigm.
Yes.
And I'm trying to diffuse evangelical, liberal. I'm trying to take all of that out to ask one question: why has it been so difficult for whites to serve Black and brown persons in America?
That's a great question. And the fact is, first of all, that when we serve other people, it really is true that our perspectives change. The war in the former Yugoslavia, they took people who were Bosnians and had them go and serve in Serbian communities, and Serbs and have them serve in Bosnian communities. And it brought people together because we're all human beings. And so why has this not happened more in America is a great point. Part of it is, I think, is the narratives. So for instance, you're going to have, everybody's going to have narratives about America, right? And so one white narrative about America, of course, there's not only one, would be America is a place of justice. We look at liberty and justice for all. We look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and our story is that America is a just country, and that we are a beacon for democracy in the world. And yes, there was slavery a while back, but we fought the Civil War, and there haven't been those problems for a long time. And I think that if you hold that sort of narrative, then that's going to be important to you personally, and it's a false narrative, or it's not a complete narrative, right? And so people are going to get their identity from that, and so they're going to downplay issues of racial justice and not feel the need to be involved in one another's lives. I think that's part of it. And I mean, we can't get away from the fact that people are selfish, people want power, and people are sinful. And so I think that you would see more white people who have been in a position of power and authority serving others, serving African Americans in particular, if they weren't as selfish and self-absorbed and sinful. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I do, and here's the critical point then is based upon the ethic of Jesus, and I think James Baldwin says it best that when we trade ethics for politics,
Mm,
we run into problems, and I see too much of that, which really begs the question
mm,
is whether or not we're able to live out an authentic Christian experience without, and you've got a lot of things in here in terms of self-examination, and though you kind of perused over greed and all of those other factors and flawed thinking and we've got a long way to go in terms of race relations. And if Baldwin is correct, then how can we make the kind of improvements when we're so willing to accept what has happened on January 6th at the nation's capital?
mhm. Yeah,
Because it is a contradiction of the truth of truth and love, which
yeah,
means there's no strength in love in that. There's just pure contradiction of law as you've described it.
yes,
Uh, so,
yes.
and a
And
total
I think
abandonment of the rule of law.
right, absolutely, there is. And the fact is, we need to spend time with one another. We need to spend time with people who are different from ourselves. And this is definitely true with regards to politics and with regards to race. And we need to spend time with one another, really listening. And if you hear, for instance, that an unarmed Black person has been shot, I grew up in a family that was very, I would say, sort of patriotic. In a like the authorities are always right, the police are always right. And because of my experiences, I've never been pulled over by the police for driving while white, and never had a bad experience. And what I had to do is humble myself and say, well, wait, my experience, my part of the story is so narrow. I need to listen to other people's parts of the story. So when I hear of an unarmed Black man being shot by the police, my initial feeling needs to not be, oh, I wonder what justification the police officer had. It needs to be sorrow, and it needs to be weeping, and it needs to be outrage. And so this is something that I've kind of learned from Aristotle. When you're on one side of the spectrum, you need to go to the other side. And so, and for me, that comes out of reflecting on my biases, the way I was raised, and how the ways that I was raised and my experiences influence how I hear the news. So repentance really is necessary for all of us. This is not to invalidate our part of the story, but we each have just a narrow part of the story. And we have to be humble and say, I want to be open to the rest of the story, which means I want to be open to perspectives very different from mine.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you.
We have a couple questions in the chat, so I'm going to read a couple of those.
Michelle, before you read that one,
yeah.
because I know we're running short on time, this is something I shared with Michelle. If you have questions, submit them in the chat box, and I would love to have an event. We can schedule another event and maybe put it on a weekend when fewer people are busy, or in the evening. And if you submit it in the chat box, we'll have an event in which we'll just talk about those questions. So I know we won't be able to get to them all today, but please submit them, and then we'll have another event, and Michelle will let you know about it, and we'll just talk about those questions. So.
Yep, we'll share the Zoom link with everyone who's attending today so that you can join in on that. Thanks for that, Andy. So one of the questions was, when I toggle between Fox and CNN, I get totally confused. How do you manage confusion when you follow all sources?
That's a great point. Yeah, so I suppose confusion, one thing is I would say this, the first thing I want to say is it's okay to be confused. Let's embrace confusion. I'm an analytic philosophy professor. My field is in analytic philosophy, so I want clarity immediately. There's a process, a dialogical process to understanding truth, and we need to be okay with the ambiguity, right? And this relates also to Reverend Bell's question, right? We have to be comfortable with the ambiguity of just meeting people and hearing their perspectives and not having to necessarily judge it right in the moment. So that's the first thing I would want to say is let's embrace confusion as part of a path towards understanding. And what I like to do is if I look at what Fox says and I look at what CNN said, then I want to read, if there's differences in those accounts, then what I want to do is do my own research as much as I can, look at other news sources and then try to find original research if it's available. And so you're right that this can be confusing and you don't know what to think, and that's okay. We always want to feel like we need to know what to think. We don't have to, it's fine. The truth is out there, to quote the X-Files, and from a Christian perspective, God has the truth. I don't have to have it all the time. So be willing to be confused and then just continue moving through that process to get more clarity. But I do think that we want to balance these news sources against one another, try to find objective sources, more objective sources whenever we can. And I encourage people to journal about the topics and issues that they really are interested in. And to bring those perspectives and to do research. It's a great question.
I think we might have time for one more. This was a great question. Let me find it. Can you explain what pragmatic idealism is? And can you give an example of that?
Yes, so that sounds like a contradiction in terms. So each one of us are idealists. This means that we have ideals or goals that we have for ourselves, for our family, for our community, for our workplace, for our country, right? So we have these ideals, but because we are impatient and because we fall into suppressed evidence, we're not willing to look at the other side of the story. We want to insist upon our understanding of the ideals being implemented right now. And so there's a lack of patience there, and also perhaps in some cases a lack of listening to others. So what I want to do is say, look, if I'm an idealist who wants my ideals, if they are true, to actually come into existence, to be actualized. So I say, this is my ideal. What steps would we have to take as a nation or as a family or me as an individual in order to have that ideal realized? And what you realize in the country as a whole, it's going to take a number of steps usually to bring people along, to help the other side change their mind a bit, and it could involve compromises. And so, perhaps you believe in a single-payer healthcare system. But in our country, there are many people who would be opposed to that for a number of reasons. They would be suspicious of it. They are concerned about government having too much power. And so what do? You say, okay, well, let me listen to those other sides of the issue. And if I'm a politician, hey, maybe let's not go to single health care, but here's one of the benefits of it. Let's try to incorporate it into our current healthcare system. And let's try to incorporate it in a way that people on both sides of the aisle can see the wisdom of. So being willing to being patient, that your ideals might not be implemented right now. They might be implemented 5 or 10 years from now. And being able to work with other people to the practical steps to get that done. Here would be a practical example. Let's say that you are in a workplace and people want to unionize. They say, this is unjust, the way we're being treated, we want to unionize. And you might say, well, yeah, I have that goal that we would be treated with respect by management. But I don't want to just unionize. I want to ask the question, if I unionize, what will happen next? What's the next step? How will the union function? Will we actually be able to meet our goals? And I would kind of work step by step through that process. So that's the idea. Let's work towards our ideals in a way that's practical and that brings as many other people in the community along with us as we can.